All right, so we have Roman myths. For the Roman myths, we're just going to skim. Many of their myths, as you know, are based on Greek myths. Now would be a good time to look at the chart on page 691 of your book that lists the Greek and Roman names for many of the characters we have covered. Let's start with the definition of classical myths. Simply put, they are stories that society tells itself about its values. The Romans adapted many things from Greece to suit their own needs: art, history, philosophy, statuary, myths. The names may change, but much of the stories we learn remain the same. Now for a bit of history. Be sure to read your book, but we'll go over the highlights. In 753 BC, that's 8th century BC, we have the founding of Rome, which happens to be about the same time as Homer and Hesiod lived. In the 5th century BC, there's the Golden Age in Athens. After that, we find that Greece was waning while Rome was rising. So there was a shift in power. In 323 BC, that's the date for the end of the classical Greece. We place it at the time of the death of Alexander the Great. So his death is what marks the end of classical Greece. Between 323 and 331 BC, during the Hellenistic age, that's, Hellenistic means all Greek, Greece was still fruitful culturally, not politically so much. Remember that the Romans would have interacted with Hellenistic Greeks, which can be seen in their art, dramas, heard in their myths. As mighty as the Romans became, they still looked to Greece with admiration. At this time, Greece was colonizing in Italy, near Naples especially. That means that the Romans would have interacted with these Greeks culturally. So they knew each other. It's not two separate cultures that were separated by a long span of time. So in 146 BC, when the Romans conquered Greece politically, they took over much of the existing Greek material and kept it as their own. What are some of the differences? First, the Romans prided themselves as practical. Why reinvent the wheel when the Greeks had built a good one? Well, there already were Italian gods, for instance, Janus, backwards and forwards, and some household and family gods, Laris and Penatus. They kept these. They assumed that the major gods were the same, as opposed to the Egyptian gods, for instance. So they just used their Roman names for them. Romans also gradually demytholized the myths, taking some of the mystery out of them. For instance, Zeus didn't come to Danae in a shower of gold. He bribed her with gold. The Romans had mixed feelings about the Greeks. Greeks were superior culturally. That means with the art and drama and literature. That's why you have Romans using the Greek names for people and gods in the arts. However, Greeks were inferior in many ways. They were considered soft, effeminate, tricky, untrustworthy. Funny enough, Greeks acted as tutors for the Roman children. Okay, their view of the Trojan War, the Romans' view of the Trojan War, reflects differences too. Greek origin stories go back to the beginning of time, ancient culture, admirable pedigree, while the Roman origin starts in 753 BC, new culture. To make that worse, Romans were descended from losers since the Trojan War. The Trojans lost the war. Still, by connecting to Aeneas, they gave themselves an ancient past history, one that was connected to divinity. And in 146 BC, when Rome conquered Greece, it was like part 2 of the Trojan War. And this time, the Trojans, now Romans, won. It was important for them to make that connection, even though there is no historical proof that someone escaped from Troy and founded a new race in Italy. Even if that happened, they would have just been absorbed into the Italian culture that was already there. There was a 400-year gap. Then, according to the Roman tradition, descendants of Aeneas founded Rome in 753 BC. The Roman traditions existed, and they hooked it to the Greek Aeneas. Hopefully you've heard of Romulus and Remus, even if you didn't know their connection to Rome. They are descendants of Aeneas. They're also twins, and at birth suckled by a she-wolf and then raised by shepherds. They're supposed to be children of the princess Rhea Silvia and Mars, Ares. Mars is the Roman, while Aries is the Greek. Rome wasn't too nice at its founding, being populated by hunters and robbers. While Romulus is considered a hero and has heroic traits, he's not necessarily a good person. He kills his brother Remus, names the city Rome after himself, and rules it. The city is founded on the murder of a brother. Remember, the city was initially populated by hunters and robbers. They needed women to propagate the city, so they went to a religious festival and abducted all of the Sabine women by force and rape. Livy, a Roman, tells the story with two endings. One that Romulus is taken into the clouds by the gods when he dies, and one where the Roman senators tear him to pieces. Now, unlike early Greece, Rome was a literate country, meaning people could read and could write from the beginning, so there were no sung stories or oral traditions. The myths were not pristine, but were deliberately worked on as pieces of literature. That is a big departure from Greek traditions. Ovid is the main source for many myths. Apollo and Daphne, Phaeton, Narcissus, Niobe, for example. It's problematic when your main source of stories is a piece of literature. How do you know if it's true? After 3 years of war with Carthage, which was foretold in the Aeneid, Rome became a world power, but there was a lot of unrest internally. There was the 44 BC assassination of Julius Caesar. After his death, there was a power struggle and fighting between Mark Antony and Cleopatra from Egypt and Octavian, who's Caesar's adopted son. Eventually, Octavian won and became Augustus. Augustus wanted to restore some traditional values to Rome. He wanted a return to the old-style religion of the gods. He wanted a return to old-style morality that encouraged marriage and fertility. His time was also the golden age of literature. Virgil and Horace were favorites of Augustus, but Ovid was not. Ovid wrote poetry about love affairs, some violent, some charming, men and women, men and men, men and animals, men and statues, things that didn't sit well with Augustus. Augustus did not like Ovid's themes, and so Ovid was exiled in 8 AD and died in exile. He's the author of Metamorphoses. You remember them for early on because they dealt with all kinds of changes in the forms of God and men. It's a collection of myths that all involve some sort of transformation. Now I'm going to end the slide here and begin another one so that I don't make the recording too long.